It began like any other college night. September 10th, 2011. A freshman student left her dorm after a party. Her name was Jessica Miller, 19 years old, bright, ambitious, and just starting her first semester. At 11:15 p.m., she walked out alone. She carried no phone, no laptop. She told no one where she was going. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When Jessica didn't return, friends thought she had stayed with her boyfriend. But by morning, panic spread. Her room was untouched. Her belongings were still there. Her phone, her computer, even her jacket. Only Jessica was missing. Police launched an immediate investigation. Search teams combed the campus and nearby woods. Helicopters circled the skies. Volunteers posted flyers across the city. But nothing appeared. No footprints, no clothing, no body. Her boyfriend, Kyle Thompson, quickly became the prime suspect. They had argued that night, witnesses said. Kyle admitted he went home early and slept alone. He had no alibi. The media painted him as violent, unstable, and guilty. But without evidence, police could not charge him. The case stalled. Within months, it went cold. For 10 years, Jessica's family lived in silence. Her boyfriend lived under suspicion. The trail disappeared into darkness. Until September 2021. A hunter walking his dog in the woods near campus noticed something strange. His dog began digging at the ground. There, beneath a shallow layer of dirt and leaves, lay human bones, torn clothing, a student ID. The name on it was Jessica Miller. Her body had been hidden for a decade, and with it, the truth. Investigators would soon uncover a secret connection, one that pointed not to her boyfriend, but to a man no one had dared to suspect. Jessica Lynn Miller was 19 years old. She came from Houston, Texas, a city of noise, highways, and steady suburban neighborhoods. Her family lived in one of those neighborhoods, a quiet place where kids rode bikes until dark and neighbors still waved from driveways. It was an ordinary home, an ordinary street, and that was exactly why her disappearance shook everyone so deeply. Jessica was born in 1992. She grew up in a middle-class household. Her father, Robert Miller, worked as a manager in an oil and gas company. It was steady work, long hours, but it paid the bills. Her mother, Karen, taught middle school. She was the kind of teacher who stayed after class to help struggling kids and kept extra supplies in her desk for students who didn't have enough. Jessica also had an older brother, David, 3 years ahead of her. By 2011, he was studying electrical engineering at the University of Texas. The Millers were a family with schedules, homework, family dinners, and weekend errands. Nothing about them looked unusual from the outside. Jessica's childhood was typical of her neighborhood. She was described as polite, studious, and respectful. Teachers said she was the student who always turned in assignments on time. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was consistent. She joined the drama club in high school, not for leading roles, but because she liked the teamwork. She enjoyed writing. She carried journals everywhere. Even as a teenager, she filled notebooks with short essays, story fragments, and daily reflections. Friends would tease her about always writing things down, but later, her journals would become crucial to understanding what had been happening in her life. Her friends from Houston remembered her as quiet at first, then warm and easygoing once she opened up. Neighbors described the Miller family as close-knit. They went to church on Sundays, they hosted small gatherings on holidays, and they kept to a simple, steady life. Jessica was not reckless. She was independent, yes, and sometimes clashed with her parents when she wanted to make her own decisions. But she wasn't the kind of teenager who disappeared for days or got into major trouble. By 2010, Jessica was ready for a new chapter. She had been accepted into Arizona State University, hundreds of miles away from home. It was her first time living out of state. Her parents helped her move into East Hall, dorm room 302. Like so many freshmen, she was excited and nervous at the same time. She made friends quickly. She joined activities, went to events, and adjusted to the new pace of college life.
Jessica studied English literature. She had dreams of writing, maybe journalism, maybe teaching. Professors described her as bright and attentive. She took notes diligently. She kept up with assignments. She was the kind of student no one expected to vanish into thin air. At ASU, she also began dating Kyle Thompson, a 20-year-old from Phoenix. Kyle was a fellow student. Their relationship, however, was not always stable. Friends described frequent arguments. Some were small, disagreements about time, about priorities. Others were more intense, with Kyle showing flashes of temper. Jessica sometimes wrote about these fights in her journals, noting her frustration and uncertainty about the relationship. By September 2011, things between them were strained.
Around campus, whispers began about another part of Jessica's life. Some students noticed she had a close connection with Professor Richard Hall, one of the faculty members in her department. Hall was older, married, and respected. No one could confirm the details, but friends recalled moments when Jessica seemed unusually anxious after speaking with him. At the time, no one reported it. No one thought it would matter. Only later, after everything came to light, would investigators re-examine those whispers. Jessica lived a typical student life. She attended classes, ate in the dining hall, and studied in the library. But she always carried her journal. She wrote down where she went, who she met, what she felt. Her words were precise, factual, less emotional than you might expect from a teenager. That habit gave investigators a window into her last weeks. On September 10, 2011, Jessica joined other students at a dorm party. It was a Saturday night. Students played music, drank, and laughed. Jessica wore a white t-shirt, light jeans, and a thin navy jacket. Witnesses remembered her talking with friends, drinking a soda, and sitting quietly in the corner for part of the night. Around 11:15 p.m. she left. She didn't take her phone. She didn't bring her laptop. She didn't even tell her roommate where she was going. The roommate assumed she was going for a walk or maybe meeting Kyle. But Jessica never came back. That detail, the exact outfit, the precise time, would later be repeated in every news report. It was the last confirmed sighting. Her life until that night had been normal, steady, predictable. A 19-year-old with an ordinary family, a dorm room, a boyfriend, and classes waiting on Monday morning. That is what makes her disappearance stand out. She wasn't running away. She wasn't living a secret double life. She was, by all accounts, a young woman building her future. Her background created no reason to suspect the tragedy that followed. A suburban home in Houston, a supportive family, a brother in college, a record of good grades. No debts, no crimes, no history of vanishing. For investigators, it made the case even harder. The trail started with a student walking out of a dorm, and for 10 years it stopped right there. But Jessica Miller was not just a name in a file. She was a daughter, a sister, and a student whose story began in an ordinary neighborhood and ended in the most extraordinary mystery. Her journals, her choices, and her final night would later show that something darker had been happening beneath the surface. Jessica's full name was Jessica Lynn Miller. She was born and raised in Houston, Texas. Her father, Robert, was 48 years old at the time of her disappearance. He worked long hours in management at an energy company. Her mother, Karen, was 45, balancing her role as a teacher with raising her 2 children. Jessica's older brother David was 22 in 2011, focused on his own studies. The Millers lived at 7423 Willow Creek Drive, a modest 2-story house in West Houston. It wasn't wealthy, it wasn't poor. It was stable. Neighbors recalled the Miller family as friendly, dependable, and calm. They had no enemies, no visible drama, no scandals. That was what made Jessica's disappearance feel like lightning from a clear sky. Jessica's early years were filled with typical activities: school plays, church events, summer camps. She was a strong student, drawn to writing and literature. Teachers described her as bright but quiet. She avoided attention, but when she joined conversations, she spoke with clarity. Her journals, later collected by investigators, showed her personality in detail. She wrote about family dinners, about frustrations with homework, about hopes for the future. She was not a reckless teenager. She was careful, methodical, and deliberate. That is why her sudden decision to leave the dorm party without her phone raised questions. It was out of character. Jessica valued independence. Friends said she often made her own decisions, even if her parents disagreed. She wasn't rebellious in dramatic ways, but she wanted control over her life. That independence sometimes led to small conflicts at home, but nothing beyond what most families face. In 2010, Jessica started her freshman year at ASU. She lived in East Hall, room 302. She adapted quickly. She participated in group activities, kept up with studies, and spent hours in the library. She remained committed to her habit of journaling, documenting even small events like meals, weather, or casual conversations. Friends noticed her balance, serious about academics but still willing to join parties and social events. She wasn't isolated. She wasn't reckless. She lived like any freshman adjusting to a new world. Jessica's boyfriend, Kyle Thompson, became central to the investigation. Their relationship was rocky. Arguments were frequent. Kyle's temper and Jessica's independence often collided. Witnesses at the dorm party confirmed they had argued that very night. That was enough for police to focus on him, though evidence never tied him directly to her disappearance. Rumors about Jessica's connection with Professor Richard Hall were more complex. Some students noticed interactions that seemed... September 10, 2011, was an ordinary Saturday that turned into the last night of Jessica's life. At the party, she was dressed casually. White t-shirt, light jeans, navy jacket. Witnesses placed her leaving at 11:15 p.m. She left alone. She didn't take her phone. She didn't carry her laptop. She left behind her personal items in the dorm room. Her roommate thought nothing of it at first. Students often stepped out for a walk or to meet someone. But Jessica never came back. By morning, her bed was still made, her belongings untouched. That silence would grow into the center of the investigation. For 10 years, her name would be tied to rumors, suspicion, and unanswered questions. For 10 years, her family would wait. The truth about what happened to her was buried, literally, in the woods near campus, until a hunter's dog unearthed it in 2021. If you found Jessica's story haunting, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to True Crime Gone Girls for more real disappearances, cold cases, and untold mysteries. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened that night? Your voice keeps these stories alive. September 10th, 2011. A Saturday night on the campus of Arizona State University. East Hall, one of the busiest dorms on campus, was alive with music, chatter, and the restless energy of hundreds of students. It was the second weekend of the fall semester. For freshmen like Jessica Miller, it was a chance to fit in, to be part of the scene. That night, dozens of students crowded into a third-floor common room. Speakers blasted pop songs. Red cups passed from hand to hand. People leaned against door frames, moved through the hallways, and spilled out onto balconies. Jessica joined her friends around 10 p.m. She wore jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and a navy windbreaker. She wasn't known as a heavy drinker. A few classmates later said they saw her with a soda in her hand, chatting quietly at the edge of the crowd. Still, something about her seemed distracted. Several witnesses recalled seeing her step out onto the balcony twice during the party. The music inside drowned out most conversations, but outside, some people noticed she made a phone call. No one could hear the words, and no one could confirm who she was calling. The phone records reviewed later by investigators showed no outgoing calls during that time. Jessica had left her phone in her dorm room. That meant she either borrowed a phone or was simply pretending. Those small inconsistencies would matter later. At around 11 p.m., tension rose. Jessica's boyfriend, Kyle Thompson, arrived at the party. Students said they exchanged words, heated words. The fight didn't last long, maybe 5 minutes, but it was loud enough that several people remembered it clearly. Some described Kyle's face as flushed, his voice sharp. Others insisted Jessica was the one who wanted to end the argument quickly, walking away before it escalated. By 11:15 p.m., Jessica was seen heading for the exit. She wasn't stumbling, she wasn't crying. She looked composed, even determined. She walked down the hallway, past the cameras in East Hall, and pushed open the doors that led outside. That footage, later reviewed frame by frame, was the last confirmed image of her alive. Her appearance was recorded in detail. White t-shirt, light jeans, navy jacket, shoes that were practical for walking. No purse, no bag, no phone, no laptop. Everything she owned remained in room 302. If she was leaving for good, she wasn't prepared.
At the time, no one thought much of it. Students came and went all night. Some left to grab food, some left to wander the campus. Her roommate assumed she'd be back in a few hours. But the final moments caught in witness testimony add a layer of unease. One male student leaving the building saw Jessica as he crossed the courtyard. He described her walking with steady steps toward the small service road that ran behind the dorm. That road ended at a tree line. Beyond it stretched a patch of woods that students often used as a shortcut to nearby housing. He remembered her walking alone, no one following, no one waiting. She didn't look back. She disappeared into the shadows cast by the trees. That was the last sighting anyone could place with certainty. Investigators later studied the security cameras. The footage inside East Hall was limited. The dorm had a single camera on the main floor positioned to monitor the entry doors. Jessica walked across its frame at 11:15 p.m. The timestamp matched what witnesses said. After that, the cameras offered nothing. No outdoor surveillance existed in that part of campus in 2011. Conditions that night were ordinary. The weather was clear, no rain, no wind. The temperature hovered around the mid-70s, cooling into the 60s. The paths around the dorms were lit by campus lamps. Visibility was decent. It was not a night when someone could vanish easily. And yet, Jessica vanished.
The following morning, her roommate expected to see her return. The bed remained untouched. Her phone and laptop were still sitting on the desk. A half-finished bottle of water and her backpack were where she left them. The clock ticked into late morning. Still no Jessica. By the afternoon of September 11th, concern turned into alarm. Jessica missed a study session she had arranged with classmates. She didn't respond to knocks on her door. She didn't answer calls. By evening, her roommate contacted campus security. From there, the case began.
What made the disappearance chilling were the details she left behind. Students who run away typically take essentials. Jessica had taken nothing. Her wallet remained. Her identification remained. Her personal items remained. If she had intended to meet someone, she went unprepared. Investigators later pieced together her last hours in painstaking detail. Witnesses gave consistent accounts of her being at the party until about 11 p.m. The argument with Kyle was verified by multiple people. The footage at 11:15 p.m. proved she walked out alone. One student outside saw her heading toward the tree line. After that, silence. No more sightings. No more traces. Police searched the wooded area the next day. Volunteers joined them. Dogs combed the ground. Helicopters scanned overhead. They expected to find something: a piece of clothing, a shoe, a path that suggested where she went. But the woods yielded nothing. The trails remained empty. The absence of evidence made her case baffling from the start. No struggle, no sound, no scream. Students inside the dorm heard nothing unusual. When investigators searched her room, they found her phone exactly where she had left it. The last activity on it was earlier that afternoon. A few texts, nothing suspicious. The laptop contained school notes and some journal entries. None indicated she planned to leave. The clock between 11:15 p.m. and midnight became the black hole of the case. Jessica left a crowded building. She walked a short distance into a familiar area. Then, she was gone. Later, when the case grew colder, people speculated about those missing minutes. Did she meet someone in the woods? Did someone lure her away? Was she taken against her will? Or did she slip further into the darkness on her own, only to meet danger by accident? The timeline didn't add up cleanly. Students claimed the argument with Kyle had upset her. Some believed she left to clear her head. Others insisted she had plans to meet someone else, though no proof was found. What stood out was the precision. 11:15 p.m., she walked out the door. After that, the world closed in on her. Campus security pulled every available camera feed from nearby buildings. None showed her leaving the area. It was as if she had walked into the woods and never walked out. Her parents later told investigators that Jessica always called home on weekends. That call never came. When Sunday ended, the Millers realized something had gone terribly wrong. The search intensified in the following days. Friends handed out flyers with her picture. The image taken from her student ID showed a smiling 19-year-old in a simple shirt. Underneath it, the word missing appeared in bold black print. Those flyers covered telephone poles, bus stops, and bulletin boards across campus. But in those early hours, those first few days, the only facts investigators had were stark and simple. Jessica Miller attended a party. She argued with her boyfriend. At 11:15 p.m., she walked out alone. A student saw her heading toward the woods, and she never came back.
The more investigators pressed, the more the details hardened into a haunting pattern. Her phone and laptop untouched. Her clothes simple and recognizable. The time logged precisely. The last sighting confirmed. Then, nothing. Years later, when her body was discovered, investigators revisited these very details. They realized the importance of that single night. Every choice, every step, every witness statement traced back to September 10, 2011, the moment when Jessica Miller walked out of East Hall and disappeared into silence. Her story didn't begin in the woods. It began in a crowded dorm party, in a brief argument, in the quiet decision to step outside. And for investigators, the unanswered question always remained. What happened in the space between that last camera frame at 11:15 p.m. and the darkness that followed? Those missing minutes still hold the weight of the case. They were the moments when Jessica Miller slipped from being a student among friends to becoming the center of a mystery that would last a decade. Morning came without Jessica. September 11th, 2011, 7:40 a.m. Her roommate noticed the untouched bed. The navy jacket Jessica had worn to the party was gone, but everything else was there. Phone on the desk. Laptop open with a document titled ENG 101, Draft. Student ID on the dresser. A small wallet with $20 and a cafeteria card. Nothing suggested a trip. Nothing suggested a plan. By 10:15 a.m., messages were piling up. Friends knocked. No response. The roommate walked to the RA on duty. They checked common rooms and bathrooms. No sign of her. Noon hit. The RA filed an internal report with housing. At 1:05 p.m., campus safety was notified. At 3:42 p.m., East Hall security reviewed the limited camera feed from the lobby. One clip mattered. 11:15 p.m., September 10th. Jessica in a white t-shirt, light jeans, navy windbreaker. She walked out the front doors. No one followed in the next 30 seconds. The camera could not see beyond the glass. At 6:02 p.m., the city police took the missing person report. The case became official. Detectives were assigned. The first 24 hours began. Police arrived at East Hall at 6:30 p.m. They sealed room 302 with yellow tape. Not because it was a crime scene, but because it might be. They photographed the desk, the laptop screen, the arrangement of items on the dresser, the closet space, and the bed. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage to the lock, no blood, no struggle. The window was secure. Everything read, "Routine dorm room." That was the problem. The room said nothing. They collected the laptop and phone under chain of custody. The phone showed no calls or texts after 6:12 p.m. The battery level at the time of seizure was 38%. The laptop log showed last keyboard activity at 7:41 p.m., likely before Jessica left for the party. The digital forensics team would later mirror both devices. In these first hours, the urgent task was simpler. Find where she went. Detectives began interviewing. The roommate first. She confirmed the basics. Jessica attended a party, argued with her boyfriend Kyle, then left. The roommate thought she would be back. She added a detail. Jessica had stepped out to the balcony twice during the party. She seemed tense. The roommate didn't know why. The boyfriend became the focus. That is standard. Domestic partners and significant others are always the first path in. Detectives called Kyle at 11:48 p.m. He answered. He agreed to come in. The interview began at 12:37 a.m., September 12th. Detectives read him his rights. He waived counsel at first. He looked anxious. He rubbed his hands. He said he wanted to help. He confirmed the argument. It started inside the common room and moved to the hallway. He said Jessica accused him of being controlling. He claimed he told her to text when she got back to her room. He said he left the party around 11:10 p.m., 5 minutes before she did, and drove to his apartment in Phoenix. He lived alone. He said he went to sleep. No one could verify that. He had no roommate, no neighbor who saw him arrive. His phone's last tower ping that night placed him on the freeway heading west. But the timing window was wide enough that he could not be placed at a fixed location when Jessica vanished. Detectives noted his demeanor. Defensive. Uneven. They also noted something else. There were no visible injuries on him. No scratches, no bruises, no marks consistent with a struggle. When asked if he walked with Jessica toward the woods, Kyle said no. He said he left the dorm before she did. He said he did not see her outside. He repeated that he drove home and slept. The officers pressed him on the absence of an alibi. He had none. That made him a prime suspect in the public mind and the obvious direction for police. At 2:11 a.m., he requested a short break. At 2:29 a.m., the interview resumed with counsel present. He maintained the same story. Detectives ended the session at 3:03 a.m. He was not arrested. There was no evidence to hold him. Morning brought the first field search. At 7 a.m., patrol officers, campus security, and volunteers formed a line at the edge of the campus woods. They created a grid. They walked slowly, eyes down, looking for fabric, paper, a shoe, anything. Cadaver dogs were requested. Aviation was requested. By noon, 2 teams with dogs began working the trails. At 3 p.m., a helicopter with an FLIR camera flew a slow pattern over the tree canopy. None of it produced results. Back at East Hall, the initial evidence sweep finished. Latent prints were lifted from Jessica's door, desk, and laptop. They belonged to Jessica, her roommate, and a handful of friends. Nothing unusual. A luminol test in the room was not. By late afternoon, detectives drafted subpoenas for phone records, email logs, and social media metadata. Even if she left her phone in the room, she used it earlier that day. Her contacts and messages might point to plans. They also obtained a warrant for Kyle's phone and vehicle. The car was impounded. Forensics swabbed the trunk, seats, handles, and floor mats. Luminol was used. Nothing. No blood. No trace that matched Jessica. Later DNA reports would come back consistent with Kyle, and unrelated secondary profiles, typical of shared environments. Nothing probative. The week condensed into a pattern: canvass, interview, recheck, repeat. Officers knocked on doors at nearby apartments. They asked about late-night screams, car doors slamming, unusual headlights on the service road. Most residents heard the party. Few heard anything else. A jogger claimed he ran through the campus at 11:30 p.m. He did not see a young woman in a navy jacket. Another student swore he saw a couple by the tree line, but when pressed on time and description, his details shifted. He recanted 2 days later. False leads drained hours. On Wednesday, the department held a short press briefing. The statement was cautious. "We are pursuing all leads," the spokesperson said. "We are not ruling out foul play. We are not ruling out voluntary departure. We ask the public for patience." Reporters pressed for a name. They wanted the boyfriend. Police would not name him. The press named him anyway. By Thursday, the story ran on local news. Boyfriend last seen arguing with missing student. Photos of Kyle from his social media flashed on screens. Comment sections filled with judgment. Friends pulled away. He stopped going to class. He hired counsel. He made no more public remarks. Inside the case file, investigators wrote what the public did not see. Kyle's apartment produced no trace evidence. His car produced no trace evidence. His timeline had gaps, but also cell site records consistent with a drive away from campus. It didn't exonerate him. It didn't convict him. It left him sitting in a gray zone, easier to blame than to prove. Detectives widened the circle. They looked for anyone who might have met Jessica after 11:15 p.m. They reviewed her schedule. They interviewed classmates. They requested course rosters. They brought in faculty for brief conversations about any concerns in class. Most had none. One name appeared more than once: Professor Richard Hall. Students said Jessica respected him. A few mentioned seeing her in his office more often than usual. At that stage, it read, search teams returned to the woods on Friday with a refined plan. They marked a 2-mile radius from East Hall. They split it into sectors. They used a sifting screen at areas where leaf litter gathered. They looked under culverts and along drainage ditches. Still nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of fabric. The cadaver dogs did not alert. The helicopter found nothing unusual in heat signatures. The creek beds were dry. The ground gave up no answers. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. If Jessica had been attacked near the dorm, something should have been left behind. If she had been taken by force into a vehicle, someone should have heard or seen movement. If she had fallen, a search should have found her. None of those paths produced facts. The case leaned back to relationships. That is how many investigations bend when the scene is quiet. On Saturday, detectives re-interviewed party witnesses to tighten the timeline. They cross-checked statements against the lobby camera timestamp. Small inconsistencies emerged. One friend moved the argument earlier by 10 minutes. Another remembered seeing Jessica smile after the fight, which did not match the roommate's description of stress. None of it changed the core. She left at 11:15 p.m. She walked toward the tree line. She never returned. They examined ride-share records and taxi logs. Few students used taxis on campus. Rideshare services were not as common in 2011. No driver reported picking up a young woman in a navy jacket near East Hall that night. They checked bus schedules. No routes fit the timeline. Evidence control logged 23 items in the first week: the phone, the laptop, the student ID copy, the whiteboard calendar from her room, the bottle of water on her desk, a pair of sneakers under the bed, the clothing inventory from the closet, the roommate's written timeline, and digital copies of the lobby camera footage. Nothing from that list pointed to a destination. Nothing pointed to a plan.
Saturday evening, police executed a search warrant at Kyle's apartment with his counsel present. They photographed the interior. They collected bedding, towels, and a vacuum bag. They removed the trash. A lab processed the samples for blood and trace. Negotiator. No transfer consistent with transporting a body. No fibers consistent with Jessica's known clothing. No latent prints of hers beyond a few on a coffee mug from earlier in the week, when she had visited while they were still on decent terms. Those prints could have been days old, not probative. On Sunday, day 8, the department expanded public outreach. Flyers with Jessica's photo covered campus and local businesses. Tips began to arrive by phone and email. Many were vague. Some were wrong. A few were malicious. Detectives triaged each lead. Officers called back. They visited addresses. They verified names. More hours disappeared into dead ends. In the second week, investigators tried a different angle. They mapped Jessica's last known movements in a location analysis. They plotted the lobby camera exit, the reported direction toward the service road, the likely path into the woods, the locations of nearby lights, the distance to the nearest off-campus street, the time it would take to walk from the dorm to each intersection. They ran the math. In 5 minutes, she could reach the tree line. In 10, she could reach the far side of the small wooded patch. If someone met her by prearrangement, that person could have waited by the darker edge of the trees without being seen from the dorm windows. That scenario required a meeting. The phone left behind argued against it. Unless the meeting was set in person earlier, unless it involved someone close enough that messages were not needed. Detectives raised the pressure on Kyle again. They asked him to take a polygraph. His counsel declined. That refusal meant nothing legally, but in the court of public opinion, it carried weight. The press repeated it. "Boyfriend declines lie detector." The story hardened into a familiar shape. People decided on guilt without proof. Meanwhile, the family arrived from Houston. Robert and Karen Miller stood in front of cameras asking for help. Their voices were steady. They said they trusted the police. They invited anyone with information to come forward anonymously. The same clip ran for days. It generated sympathy. It did not generate new facts. The first 14 days closed with a short summary in the case log. Last confirmed sighting, 11:15 p.m., lobby camera. Last witness outside, male student, saw her walking toward tree line. Weather, clear, mild. Room, orderly. Electronics left behind, no evidence of departure planning. Boyfriend, argument documented, alibi unverified, car and apartment negative for forensic evidence. Searches, campus woods and surrounding sectors, K9 and aviation, negative. Digital, phone/laptop mirrored, no indicators of intent to leave. Leads, none with probative value. Investigators did not stop, but the case shifted from the urgent pace of a hot search to the slower rhythm of a developing cold case. Patrols moved on. Volunteers returned to class. The flyers faded in the sun. Inside the squad room, a detective added a simple note to the whiteboard. Revisit non-romantic contacts. That meant professors, teaching assistants, lab partners, and anyone who held authority over Jessica's academic life. It meant checking office hours and grade disputes. It meant looking where people do not like to look. Informal conversations with students surfaced Professor Richard Hall's name again.
Still, there was nothing specific. No complaint, no recorded incident, no email that crossed a line. He was married. He was respected. He was a gatekeeper in the department. Without cause, there would be no warrant for his devices or office. The case stayed where it had been, wrapped around the boyfriend, trapped in a forest that revealed nothing. Week 3 brought one more search of the woods. Detectives knew that early searches miss things. They came in with fresh volunteers and a revised grid, this time focusing on drainage lines and old campsites students sometimes used. They found broken glass, old cans, a torn sweatshirt unrelated to Jessica, and a bicycle frame that had been there for months. They did not find Jessica. By now, the investigation's edges began to fray. Tips slowed. Media attention moved on. Kyle's life shrank to a small path between his apartment and his lawyer's office. He waited for a knock that never came. He wore the weight of suspicion without charges, without the chance to fight in court, without the relief of evidence that could clear him. The lead detective wrote an interim memo to command staff. It read clean and spare. Subject Miller, Jessica L., missing since September 10, 2011. Evidence does not establish homicide at this time. Evidence does not establish voluntary disappearance. Primary person of interest, Kyle Thompson, lacks alibi, but also lacks forensic linkage. Scene, search, and canvas, negative. Recommendation: maintain open status, continue periodic searches, pursue digital subpoenas, track financials, re-engage academic contacts, and revisit timeline as new data emerges. That was the official posture. Unofficially, the case had entered the hardest phase, the part where time passed and nothing changed. The part where families learned to live with phones that did not ring. Still, the file grew. Emails, transcripts, maps, receipts, call records, class rosters, grade logs, and interviews that asked the same questions in new ways. The work looked repetitive, but it mattered. Cold cases live or die on details recorded early. In the months that followed, detectives checked Jessica's bank account. No withdrawals after September 10th. They checked her cafeteria card. No swipes. They checked Greyhound, Amtrak, and flight manifests. No matches. They asked the state to flag her social security number. No activity. Life had stopped. By winter, the woods around East Hall lost their leaves. The lines of sight lengthened. A small team walked it again on a gray morning. Their boots cracked frozen mud. They found nothing. The initial investigation had done what it could. It had traced her last steps, questioned the obvious suspect, searched the probable scene, and logged the small, stubborn facts that would anchor the case for a decade. It had also set a narrative in motion that public opinion would not shake. The boyfriend, but in September 2011, none of that was known. The detectives closed their daily logs each night with the same line: pending further leads. The first phase ended there, with an empty dorm room, with a boyfriend under a cloud, with a family waiting in a hotel room, phones on the nightstand, hoping for a call that would not come, and with a file that already carried the quiet weight of tragedy, even without a body, even without proof. The investigation did not solve Jessica's disappearance. It built the foundation that would later make sense of it. It fixed the timeline. It preserved the images. It captured the voices of those who saw and heard her last. It narrowed possibilities without closing them. It kept the door open for the truth to return. Years later, when a hunter's dog scratched at a shallow rise in the woods, the people who had written those early reports would feel two things at once: the ache of what they had missed, and the relief that the ground finally had spoken. The first week after Jessica Miller vanished was chaos. Police worked around the clock, and the campus turned into a search zone. Students who had been at the party joined volunteers, combing through the grounds behind East Hall. Flashlights swept through bushes. Dogs trained to detect human scent sniffed the undergrowth. Even drones and helicopters scanned the wooded area that stretched behind the dorms. Everyone hoped for a clue: a piece of clothing, a phone, a single footprint leading somewhere. But day after day, nothing appeared. Searchers scoured the empty lot near the dorms, the trails leading into the trees, and even the creek bed that wound through the area. The woods were not vast, not the kind of wilderness where people vanish forever. And yet Jessica was gone. No jacket, no shoes, no bag, no body. It was as if she had stepped into the dark and never returned. By the second week, frustration grew. Searchers admitted they were walking the same paths again and again, finding nothing new. Officers called in specialized teams. Dogs circled, pulled on their leashes, but the scent trails faded within yards of the dorm. Helicopters hovered overhead, infrared cameras pointed at the ground, but the cameras showed no heat signatures, no signs of someone hiding or injured. The official line from investigators was cautious. "We are following every lead. We are not ruling out any possibilities." But to the public, the silence looked like failure, and soon all attention turned to one person: Kyle Thompson. Kyle was Jessica's boyfriend, a 20-year-old sophomore from Phoenix. He had been seen with her at the party, and witnesses recalled the argument. They didn't know the details, but the raised voices were enough. Within 48 hours, Kyle was called in for questioning. Detectives asked him where he had been that night, after leaving the party. Kyle said he went back to his apartment in Phoenix, about 25 minutes away, and went to bed. The problem was simple: he had no alibi. No one could confirm his story. Officers noted his nervousness. His answers seemed shaky. He denied hurting Jessica, denied following her after the fight. But investigators wrote in their notes, "Subject appears evasive." That was all the press needed. Local newspapers ran headlines: "Boyfriend last seen arguing with missing student." News crews set up outside the Phoenix apartment complex where Kyle lived. Footage of him walking to his car, shielding his face from cameras, played on the evening news. On campus, rumors spread fast. Students whispered in dining halls and classrooms. Some claimed Kyle had been jealous and controlling. Others insisted he had a temper. None of it was proven, but in the absence of real evidence, speculation filled the void. By the end of September, Kyle's name was everywhere. To many, he was already guilty. Meanwhile, Jessica's parents had flown from Houston the day after the disappearance. Robert and Karen Miller set up a small headquarters in a motel near the campus. They printed flyers with Jessica's photo, her smiling face in a graduation picture, wearing a navy cap and gown. Volunteers handed them out at gas stations, pinned them to bulletin boards, and taped them to shop windows. The Millers appeared on local television, pleading with anyone who might know something. "If you've seen Jessica, please, call the police. She is our daughter. We just want her home." But as days turned to weeks, hope began to slip away. Volunteers dwindled. By the third week, only a handful of students still joined the daily searches. Police, too, started scaling back. Officers admitted privately that they had run out of new areas to cover. The woods behind East Hall had been walked dozens of times. The creek had been searched. Even storm drains were checked. Still, no Jessica. No answers. The frustration boiled over in the Miller family. At one press conference, Robert Miller's voice cracked as he asked, "How can my daughter walk out of her dorm and vanish? How can no one know what happened?" But the hardest blow came at the end of the month. Police announced they had found no new evidence. No items belonging to Jessica. No eyewitnesses who could place her beyond the dorm exit. No surveillance cameras outside the building captured her path. Beyond the 11:15 p.m. timestamp, her walking out into the night. The trail went cold. And with no fresh leads, the case shifted. Jessica's file was no longer classified as an active emergency search. It was moved into what investigators called long-term missing persons. To the public, it was simpler. The case had gone cold.
For the Millers, this was unbearable. Their daughter had been missing for barely a month, and already the momentum was gone. They returned to Houston carrying boxes of unsent flyers, their only option left to wait by the phone. For Kyle, the cold case label brought no relief. Even without charges, the shadow of suspicion destroyed his life. Friends avoided him. Professors treated him with distance. Strangers shouted at him on campus. He tried to defend himself, repeating that he had nothing to do with Jessica's disappearance. But few listened. By winter, Kyle withdrew from classes. He dropped out of ASU, moved back in with his parents, and disappeared from public view. But the rumors never stopped. For years, in online forums and whispers around campus, Kyle Thompson's name stayed attached to Jessica Miller. The East Hall community felt the weight of the case too. Freshmen who moved into the dorm months later knew the story. They passed it along like an urban legend. The girl who walked out at night and never came back. Some insisted she had been murdered. Others claimed she had been kidnapped by someone outside the party. A few suggested she had run away voluntarily, starting a new life somewhere far away. But the facts never changed. Jessica's laptop and phone had been left in her dorm. Her wallet, with her student ID and spare cash, was untouched. She had not taken clothes or personal belongings. Nothing pointed to a voluntary disappearance. The unanswered questions kept the story alive. Why had no one seen her after she stepped into the night? Why had no physical trace been found? Why did the trail stop so suddenly? By the end of 2011, the case had become a stain on the local police department. Reporters criticized the lack of progress. The Miller family accused investigators of focusing too narrowly on Kyle, ignoring other possibilities. Campus safety was questioned. Parents of other students demanded more cameras, better patrols, more lighting in the areas around East Hall. But even with the pressure, nothing changed. No new witnesses came forward. No new evidence appeared. The file grew dusty, stacked among other unresolved cases. For the Millers, every holiday became unbearable. Jessica's birthday passed in silence. Thanksgiving dinner was incomplete. At Christmas, her stocking still hung on the mantel. Karen Miller once told a reporter, "You don't move on. You just keep waking up every day and waiting for a call that never comes." The years stretched on. The unanswered questions hardened into permanent scars. Kyle tried to rebuild his life, but the label of suspect followed him everywhere.
He applied for jobs and was turned away once his name surfaced in background checks. He avoided relationships. He avoided speaking about Jessica at all. His silence only fueled suspicion. On campus, the story became legend. Every new group of freshmen heard it. Students whispered in the dorm hallways, "This is where Jessica Miller lived. This is the dorm she walked out of before she disappeared." The lack of resolution kept people guessing. Did someone on campus target her? Did she trust the wrong person? Did she step into a car that night? Or did she meet someone in the woods behind East Hall? For 10 long years, no one could answer. 2011 ended with silence. The search parties had gone home. The flyers curled on telephone poles, fading in the sun. Jessica Miller's face looked out from old news broadcasts, her name tied forever to one haunting question. Where did she go on the night of September 10th? It was September 2021. 10 years had passed since 19-year-old Jessica Miller walked out of her dorm and never returned. For a decade, her case sat in cold files. Families grieved in silence. Suspicions circled her boyfriend. Rumors outlived facts. And then, one ordinary morning, everything changed. The discovery began with something simple: a man and his dog. A local hunter, well into his 50s, was walking his dog in the woods behind the State University of Arizona. He had been to this patch of land countless times. For years, it was used by students for trails and by locals for hunting. Search parties had combed these woods in 2011 and 2012, but found nothing. By 2021, the area was overgrown, full of thick brush and low-hanging branches. That morning, after heavy late summer rains, the ground was softer than usual. The hunter's dog caught a scent, something strange, something buried. The animal tugged hard on the leash, pulling him toward a shallow rise in the earth. The man noticed scraps of cloth, faded and dirty, peeking out from the soil. He bent down. His heart sank. It wasn't just cloth. The shape beneath was bone. Human remains. He froze for a moment, then dialed 911. Within the hour, sheriff's deputies from Yavapai County arrived and sealed off the scene. Crime tape stretched across the trees. Officers moved carefully, treating the discovery as a crime scene from the start. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was something hidden. The site was only 2 kilometers from East Hall, Jessica's dormitory. 2 kilometers. Less than a half-hour walk. Close enough to campus lights, but deep enough into the trees that an untrained eye could pass without noticing. Search teams in 2011 had swept wide, but this exact spot, covered in thick brush, had gone undisturbed. Time and weather had done the rest, concealing what had been buried in haste. When investigators carefully cleared away soil and leaves, they uncovered more. The skeleton lay only a foot beneath the surface. Whoever buried her hadn't dug deep, just enough to cover the body. Nature had been eroding the site for years. Now, rain had loosened the ground enough for scraps of fabric to surface. Next to the remains was a wallet, old, cracked, eaten away by moisture. Inside, they found the plastic edge of a student ID card. They cleaned it gently. It read, Jessica Lynn Miller. Nearby were fragments of clothing. A navy windbreaker torn at the seams, like denim, barely holding together. The outfit matched exactly what witnesses described Jessica wearing the night she left the party. A white shirt, light jeans, and that navy jacket. At that moment, after 10 years of silence, the mystery of Jessica Miller shifted. The county coroner's office took custody of the remains. Forensic anthropologists began their work. It didn't take long to reach a conclusion. Jessica hadn't run away. She hadn't gotten lost. She hadn't died in an accident. The skull revealed the truth. A massive fracture stretched across the left side of the cranium. The blow had been fatal, delivered by a hard object with enough force to kill instantly. There were no defensive wounds on the arms, no broken fingers that might suggest a struggle. That absence led experts to believe the attack was sudden, unexpected, and overwhelming. The official ruling? Homicide by blunt force trauma. Time of death, based on bone analysis and burial conditions, matched the night of September 10, 2011. Jessica had died the same night she left her dorm. This single discovery rewrote the case. For a decade, investigators had struggled with a puzzle that had no edges. Now they had the frame. They had a body. They had proof she had been murdered. The Miller family was notified immediately. Robert and Karen Miller, who had lived with questions for 10 years, flew from Houston to Arizona as soon as the news broke. Reporters filmed them walking into the sheriff's office, holding hands, their faces blank with shock. For 10 years they had prayed for answers. What they received was a confirmation no parent ever wants. Their daughter had been killed. The press ran with the story instantly. Local headlines screamed, "Cold case cracked, remains of missing student found after a decade." National outlets followed. For days, Jessica's name returned to front pages. The public, who had half forgotten the case, suddenly remembered the girl who walked out of her dorm and never came back. True crime forums lit up. News segments replayed the original footage from 2011. Students holding vigils. Friends describing Jessica as kind and bright. Kyle Thompson walking past cameras while being peppered with accusations. Now the narrative shifted. The discovery of the body meant this wasn't speculation anymore. Jessica had been murdered. Someone had buried her deliberately within walking distance of campus. And someone had lived with that secret for 10 years. The immediate reaction from law enforcement was clear. The case was reopened. A new task force was formed, combining local detectives with state investigators. The FBI offered technical support. The cold case file was no longer cold. For Kyle Thompson, the reopening was both relief and renewed torment. For 10 years, he had been branded the silent suspect. He had been the last person seen arguing with Jessica. He had no alibi. And for 10 years, people whispered his name with guilt attached. Now, with the confirmation of homicide, Kyle's name was back in headlines. News anchors asked the question directly, was the boyfriend responsible? Police re-interviewed him, retracing his steps from that night. Once again, he said the same thing. He left the party around 11:10 p.m., drove home alone, and went to bed. Once again, no witness could confirm it. Once again, suspicion pointed in his direction. But behind the scenes, detectives began to notice something new. Among Jessica's recovered belongings was not only her wallet and clothing. Investigators revisited her personal effects, especially her notebooks and journals. Stored away by her parents for a decade, her writings revealed something the original detectives had overlooked. She had written about a man, a professor, someone older, Someone she described in vague, careful lines, but enough to suggest a relationship beyond the classroom. One entry, dated weeks before her disappearance, mentioned a late-night meeting. Another hinted at arguments about responsibility and truth coming out. For investigators, these fragments opened a door. The name surfaced soon after: Professor Richard Hall. But that would come later. In September 2021, the focus remained on the shocking discovery in the woods. The forensic team finished its initial analysis. No signs of restraints. No evidence of stab wounds or bullets. Just the single crushing blow to the head. The burial was hasty. No attempt to dig deep. No effort to disguise the site beyond a quick cover of soil and leaves. The killer hadn't been thorough. They had been rushed, perhaps panicked, perhaps convinced no one would search this specific patch of forest. Investigators revisited their old maps. In 2011, searches had focused on trails and clearings. Dogs and volunteers combed obvious paths. But this burial site was slightly off those routes, in a thick area of brush. Searchers back then had probably walked within 100 feet, but without digging or noticing, the site remained hidden. The hunter's discovery underscored a brutal truth. Jessica had been close the whole time. Close to the campus, close to where her friends lived, close to where Kyle was accused, and yet invisible for 10 years. For the Miller family, the discovery was devastating. At a press conference, Robert Miller spoke softly. "We prayed for a miracle. Instead, we received the truth. We thank the man who found our daughter, but we are still waiting for justice." Karen Miller added, 10 years we waited. 10 years our daughter lay in the ground while people debated what happened. Now we know she was taken from us. We need answers. The sheriff's office promised a full-scale reinvestigation. Evidence was sent to modern labs. DNA samples were taken from the soil, from the fragments of clothing, from the remains themselves. Technology had advanced since 2011. Where once there were limits, now there were possibilities. The media frenzy reignited interest. Television programs revisited the case, presenting the new timeline. Podcasts dissected every detail, asking how investigators could have missed this for so long. Social media swirled with theories, many still targeting Kyle, others speculating about strangers, stalkers, or even campus staff. But within the evidence, detectives found a path forward. Jessica's journals, re-examined in the light of her confirmed murder, hinted at a relationship kept secret. Investigators dug deeper, and for the first time suspicion turned away from the boyfriend and toward someone no one had ever expected: a respected professor. That revelation belonged to the next chapter of the case. For now, Part 6 ended with the moment everything changed. 10 years of silence were broken by a dog's bark and a hunter's call. The mystery was no longer a disappearance. It was a homicide. Jessica Miller's body had been found, her death confirmed, her case reopened. And the stage was set for the truth, hidden for a decade, to finally come into the light. Theories swirled. Her boyfriend Kyle was smeared in headlines. Search efforts failed, and her family carried the weight of silence. But when Jessica's remains were finally uncovered in 2021, investigators reopened every box, every file, every forgotten lead. And inside her belongings, something appeared that changed the direction of the case forever. It was a notebook, The journal had been preserved by her parents, stored carefully after the dorm was cleared out in 2011. They had never read it in full, out of respect, out of pain. But now, detectives turned the fragile pages and saw details no one had ever known. Jessica had written about a relationship, not with Kyle, not with another student, but with someone she only described as older, in authority, and dangerous if exposed. She wrote about late-night meetings. She hinted at promises made to her. And in the weeks before she vanished, her handwriting grew more frantic. The final entries carried the most disturbing revelation. She believed she was pregnant. She wrote that she planned to meet the man to demand financial support. If he refused, she threatened to tell his wife, his employer, and her own family. The date of that meeting matched the night Jessica walked out of her dorm for the last time. Detectives cross-checked the timeline. Witnesses had reported Jessica arguing with Kyle around 11 p.m. at the party. 15 minutes later, she left East Hall. Security footage captured her moving through the hallway, stepping out the side door, and heading toward the back path that cut into the wooded area. She was alone. Investigators now believed she wasn't simply wandering. She was heading to a meeting, a confrontation, and the man waiting for her was not Kyle. The name surfaced quickly: Professor Richard Hall. Hall had been a respected figure at Arizona State University in 2011. He was 45 years old, married with 2 children, and taught English literature. Students described him as charismatic, strict in class but charming outside it. Some whispered about his attention toward female students, but those whispers were never recorded, never investigated, never acted on. When Jessica disappeared, Hall was interviewed only briefly. He told police he had been home with his family that night. There was no reason to suspect him. The focus was entirely on Kyle. And so Hall's name slipped quietly out of the files. Now, in 2021, the journal pulled it back in. Jessica had written his last name clearly on several pages. She detailed meetings about her essays. She wrote about conversations that turned personal. And one entry, weeks before her death, read, "RH says he'll help me if I keep quiet. But I need more than promises. For investigators, this was no longer rumor. It was evidence." The timeline was reconstructed with fresh eyes. At 11 p.m., Jessica argued with Kyle. At 11:15, she left the dorm. At the same time, her journal said she had planned to meet Hall that night, and she walked toward the wooded path where her body was later discovered. The implications were devastating. If the affair were true, Hall had everything to lose: his reputation, his marriage, his career. A pregnancy would have destroyed all of it. If Jessica threatened exposure, the motive was clear: desperation to silence her. But there was one impossible barrier. By 2021, Richard Hall was dead. He had passed away from heart disease in 2018. Any direct confrontation, any trial, any cross-examination was now beyond reach. Investigators pressed forward anyway. They interviewed former students. Some recalled rumors about Hall spending too much time with female undergraduates. One remembered seeing Jessica in his office more than once after hours. Another said Jessica seemed nervous whenever Hall's name came up. None of it was enough to prove a crime, but it formed a pattern. The forensic team reconstructed the attack. Jessica's skull fractures were consistent with blunt force trauma, likely from a heavy object or a direct blow. The burial site suggested haste. The body had been left in a shallow grave covered with leaves and dirt. Not the work of an experienced criminal, the work of someone panicked. Someone desperate to hide what had just happened. Everything aligned. Jessica had left the dorm to meet Hall. A confrontation followed. She was killed, then buried clumsily nearby. Detectives prepared their findings. They added the journal, the witness statements, the forensic results, and the timeline into the reopened case file. The conclusion? Jessica Miller was the victim of intentional homicide, likely committed by Professor Richard Hall. When the findings were shared publicly, the shock was immediate. Headlines screamed, "Professor named as possible suspect in cold case murder." News outlets replayed the story of Jessica's disappearance, contrasting it with Hall's polished career. Former colleagues expressed disbelief, but others admitted privately that Hall had long carried a reputation for inappropriate behavior that was never formally addressed. The outrage spread quickly. Students who had once known Jessica were furious that her death had been pinned on Kyle for so long. Alumni criticized the university for failing to monitor faculty behavior. Jessica's family expressed devastation that the man responsible had died before facing justice. Kyle Thompson, the boyfriend whose name had been dragged through mud for a decade, gave his first full statement. His voice was bitter. "I lost 10 years of my life. Friends turned their backs. Reporters treated me like a murderer, all because the police didn't follow the evidence. Jessica's killer lived free, and I was branded guilty. Nothing can give me back what I lost." His pain became part of the public conversation. How had law enforcement missed the signs? Why hadn't Hall been investigated in 2011 when rumors already existed? How many other cases had been compromised by narrow focus on the most obvious suspect? Experts weighed in. Criminal profilers explained that focusing solely on intimate partners often blinds investigators to alternative suspects. Legal analysts called Jessica's case an example of tunnel vision in policing. The evidence against Kyle was circumstantial, yet he carried the stigma for years. Meanwhile, the professor was never seriously examined. For Jessica's parents, the revelations cut deep. They had fought for a decade to keep her story alive. They had pleaded with police, handed out flyers, appeared on television. Now they were forced to accept that the truth had been buried not only in the forest but in ignored evidence. The university faced pressure too. Why had complaints about Hall never surfaced publicly? Why were student whispers dismissed as gossip? Administrators offered statements of sympathy but avoided accountability, insisting they had no knowledge of misconduct. By the end of 2021, the case file closed again, this time with a conclusion but no conviction. The official statement from investigators read, "While we cannot bring charges against a deceased individual, the evidence strongly suggests Professor Richard Hall's involvement in the homicide of Jessica Miller on September 10, 2011. It was the closest Jessica's family would come to justice. The community responded with anger. For 10 years, the wrong man had been judged. For 10 years, the real suspect lived quietly, teaching classes, raising a family, and carrying his secret. And for 10 years, Jessica's body lay hidden in shallow earth only 2 kilometers from her dorm. The press dissected every angle. Talk shows debated the ethics of naming a dead suspect. True crime podcasts retold the story, pointing to systemic failures in investigation. Students demanded reforms at universities to monitor relationships between faculty and students more closely. But the anger could not change the fact. Hall had died free. He would never face trial. He would never hear a jury read a verdict. He would never answer questions under oath. The truth had come too late. For Kyle, the revelations gave him freedom from suspicion, but no peace. He had abandoned his studies, lost friendships, and lived under the weight of accusation. Even with his name cleared, the years were gone. The damage permanent. For Jessica's family, closure was hollow. They had found their daughter, but only as remains in a shallow grave. They had found the likely killer, but only as a name etched on a gravestone. And for the public, the story became a grim reminder of how easy it is for justice to fail. A young woman dead, a boyfriend destroyed by suspicion, a professor shielded by reputation, a system blind to what was in front of it. The final truth was cruelly simple. Jessica Miller had not walked away from her life. She had walked into a meeting she would never survive. And the man who silenced her took his secret to the grave.
That was the twist. That was the revelation that shattered 10 years of rumor and speculation. The case had never been about a jealous boyfriend. It had always been about a professor in the shadows, hiding behind his title, his family, and his career. And because of his death, there would never be accountability. Only the knowledge that the truth had been delayed, ignored, and finally uncovered when it no longer mattered. In the end, Jessica's story was not just about her disappearance. It was about the consequences of silence. The silence of institutions that ignored rumors. The silence of investigators who focused on one suspect. The silence of a community that accepted easy answers. That silence lasted a decade, until a hunter's dog sniffing in the brush dragged the truth out of the ground. And even then, the truth came too late. When investigators named Professor Richard Hall as the likely killer, the case of Jessica Miller seemed to reach its conclusion. But the ending brought no comfort. There was no arrest, no trial, no sentence. Only a hollow truth unearthed 10 years too late. For the Miller family, the announcement shattered what little strength they had left. Robert and Karen Miller had lived through a decade of unanswered questions, clinging to the possibility that their daughter might still be alive. Now they had her remains, a shallow grave in the woods, and the knowledge that the man who ended her life had already gone to his own. Robert told reporters, "We begged for answers in 2011. We gave them her notebooks. We told them about the rumors, and still, they looked the other way. Now it's too late." His words carried not only grief, but anger. Jessica's mother, Karen, stood silently beside him, holding the recovered student ID that had once been inside Jessica's wallet. That small plastic card, faded and cracked, was now all she had left. The family returned to Houston after the identification. A funeral was held. It was small, quiet, attended mostly by relatives and a handful of Jessica's old classmates. For 10 years, she had been missing. Now she was finally laid to rest. But the closure was bitter. For Kyle Thompson, the truth was both a relief and a curse. His name had been dragged through the mud for years. Neighbors whispered, strangers pointed. Professors looked at him with suspicion. He had dropped out of school, unable to carry the weight of the accusations. When police revealed that Hall was the prime suspect, Kyle finally spoke publicly. "I lost everything, friends, college, my future. I was treated like a murderer because I argued with my girlfriend at a party. That's all it took for everyone to believe I killed her." The damage to Kyle's life could not be undone. Even though the evidence now cleared him, the years of stigma had already stolen his youth. The public reaction was swift and furious. Newspapers blasted headlines questioning the original investigation. Tunnel vision, how police missed the real suspect.
Editorials asked why Jessica's journal, which clearly pointed toward a professor, had been ignored in 2011. Former students of ASU stepped forward with stories. Some described how Hall had acted inappropriately toward female students. Others recalled how rumors of his special attention circulated long before Jessica disappeared. None of these accounts had been formally investigated. The university faced sharp criticism. Administrators expressed sympathy but denied responsibility. They insisted they had never received formal complaints about Hall. But the damage to their reputation was done. Alumni demanded reforms. Advocacy groups called for stricter boundaries between faculty and students. The case became an example in national discussions about campus safety. For law enforcement, the backlash was equally severe. Analysts criticized the investigators for focusing too heavily on Kyle in the first days of the case. Criminal profilers pointed to confirmation bias, the tendency to fixate on the most obvious suspect while ignoring alternative leads. Jessica's journal, recovered from her dorm room in 2011, had never been fully analyzed. One retired detective put it bluntly: if the journal had been read carefully, Hall would have been questioned in depth. This wasn't hindsight. The evidence was there from day one. The mistakes became part of the case's legacy. Jessica's death was not only a tragedy of violence, but of institutional failure.
That was the twist. That was the revelation that shattered 10 years of rumor and speculation. The case had never been about a jealous boyfriend. It had always been about a professor in the shadows, hiding behind his title, his family, and his career. And because of his death, there would never be accountability. Only the knowledge that the truth had been delayed, ignored, and finally uncovered when it no longer mattered. In the end, Jessica's story was not just about her disappearance. It was about the consequences of silence. The silence of institutions that ignored rumors. The silence of investigators who focused on one suspect. The silence of a community that accepted easy answers. That silence lasted a decade, until a hunter's dog sniffing in the brush dragged the truth out of the ground. And even then, the truth came too late. The lesson became clear. Justice delayed is often justice denied. For the Miller family, life was permanently divided into before and after. Before, when Jessica was alive, and after, when she became a story on the evening news. They kept her notebooks, her photographs, and the few belongings returned by investigators. Every page of her handwriting, every snapshot, was a reminder of the future she never reached. Kyle tried to rebuild. He moved away from Phoenix, started working small jobs, and avoided publicity. But the shadow of suspicion never fully left. Employers Googled his name. Neighbors remembered the headlines. Even as an innocent man, his life had been rewritten by the night Jessica disappeared. The community, too, carried scars. For 10 years, people believed Jessica's killer was known but untouchable. For 10 years, her absence haunted the halls of the university. And when the truth came out, it was too late to make it right. In the end, Jessica Miller's story became one of silence broken too late. A shallow grave revealed by chance. A journal ignored until it was almost meaningless. A suspect identified only after his death. Her case stands as a warning that evidence ignored can bury the truth as deeply as any grave, and that justice delayed can destroy lives even without conviction. Jessica did not vanish willingly. She was silenced, and the truth about her death emerged only when there was no one left to hold accountable.
That is the legacy of Jessica Miller. A family destroyed, a boyfriend exiled, a university disgraced, a community forced to ask, what if investigators had looked harder, listened sooner, or believed her words when they were first written? Because if the hunter had never brought his dog into those woods, if the soil had never shifted, if the journal had never been reread, Jessica's story might still be buried, and the world would never have known the truth.